Okay, the name of the book is The People Shapers, and it's by Vance Packard, Packard. Chapter 1, The Emerging Plastic Image of Man. We have not yet seen what man can make of man. B.F. Skinner, behavioral psychologist. B.F. Skinner's ringing pronouncement reflects ambition as much as fact, but dramatic efforts are indeed underway to reshape people and their behavior. These efforts obviously have profound implications. In quite a few instances, the implications are disquieting. Human engineers are at work in a variety of fields. They are increasing the capacity of a relatively small number of people to control, modify, manipulate, reshape the lives of a great number of other people. And they are functioning in many countries, especially in the United States, Great Britain, Germany, France, Japan, Canada, Israel, Russia, Australia, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia. These new technologies draw primarily upon discoveries in the behavioral, biological, and computer sciences. Control is being achieved over human actions, moods, wishes, thoughts. As the psychologist Perry London put it, never in human history has this occurred before, except in fantasy. The results may force us to alter our concepts of the nature of humanness. Many of the revolutionists are caught up in a fervor not normally seen in scientists, who ordinarily speak cautiously. Columbus wasn't cautious, and in substantial numbers they are not. They are now certain that new worlds can be discovered inside the human being, and they are eager to get on with the discovering. They see themselves out on the cutting edge of science. One of the geneticists, Nobel laureate Joshua Lederberg, called on U.S. Congress to appropriate at least $10 million to set up a national genetic task force. This force would make a crash effort to broaden knowledge of the genetic code, which would simplify the biological engineering of people. Robert Schimmer has exulted that for the first time since the creation of a living creature can undertake to redesign its future. He's been serving as the head of biology division at California Institute of Technology and is a driving force in the current biological revolution. Schimmer asserted we can be the agent of transition to a wholly new path of evolution. Among behavioral psychologists, there are a host of restless revolutionaries. The most famed of the behavioralists, B.F. Skinner of Harvard University, has called for a technology of behavior. Because we need to make vast changes in human behavior. A few years ago, a group of his disciples, in trying to decide what behavioral engineering is, explained, for openers, we can develop a technology for routinely producing superior human beings. We have the technology for installing any behavior we want. J.V. Mcconnell, a wide-ranging psychological explorer from University of Michigan, was quoted in 1974 as proposing, "We should reshape our society so that we all would be trained from birth to do what society wants us to do." Knowing him, I suspect he was carried away by his natural exuberance and did not intend to make any ominous call for total conformity. Some of the revolutionists seemed to relish the powers being achieved. Jose M.R. Delgado, a pioneer in brain probing and a most civil man, has called for physical control of the mind in order to develop a psycho-civilized society. He has urged the U.S. government to make conquering the mind a national goal. Other noted scientists, I should add, are cautioning the more outspoken activist. Leon Kass, a molecular biologist and ethicist, calls it an arrogant presumption that scientists think they are wise enough to remake man. Some of the projects to reshape or control man are simply intriguing. Many are disturbing. Some may make your skin crawl. By the latter, I mean such plans as keeping people under surveillance by locking transmitters to their bodies, creating subhumans for menial work and as a source of spare parts for human bodies, transplanting heads, creating humans with 4 or more parents, and pacifying troublesome people, including children, by cutting into the brain. The strategies being pressed by human engineers have caused some observers to suggest that we are hurtling toward the fictional worlds envisioned by 2 Englishmen. I refer to George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, projected for 6 centuries from now. Actually, Orwell's big brother was pretty heavy-handed and simplistic compared with Huxley's world controller, Mustafa Mond. Orwell, writing in the period of Stalin and Hitler, primarily extrapolated totalitarian policing techniques. His big brother controlled by intrusion, such as installing a watching TV eye in every home and by setting up thought police. He ruled by exquisite forms of coercion and by massive indoctrination. Huxley's controller, conceived earlier in 1932, developed his controls by far more sophisticated scientific techniques. His controller saw that total control should start at conception. In hatcheries made possible by reproductive biology, embryos were molded to order by genetic means to become humans of certain types. The level of intelligence was controlled in part by manipulating the amount of oxygen given the fetuses. Future sewer workers who needed few brains were mass-produced on low levels of oxygen. Once new humans were born, a wide variety of controls continued from infancy on. Persons were induced to love their assigned status and regime by use of neo-Pavlovian conditioning techniques, by sleep teaching and wondrous soma drug. There is no single soma drug as such today, but the states it produced, tranquility, stimulation, colorful visions, and apparently high suggestibility, all can now be produced by specific drugs or precise techniques. Most of the techniques Huxley fantasized for the distant future are already becoming available, or at least being forecast by reputable scientists. One of them is sleep teaching. Modern experiments have shown that a person can learn from messages whispered in his ear as he is falling asleep. Huxley, erroneously as it turned out, had the person deeply asleep when I learned from the whispering messages, but his idea was valid in the main. Today, there is no all-powerful controller in sight in the Western world. The coming crunch on natural resources combined with rampant overbreeding in many areas of the world make it likely that we will be hearing calls for more authoritarian governments within the coming quarter century. At any rate, there are already a host of technologists in a variety of fields who qualify as people controllers or people shapers. They are becoming, willing or not, a new elite. Many work for institutions, including governments, to help those institutions increase their power to control us and to impose their values and views on others. Meanwhile, the ordinary person's sense of power over his life is threatened. A few years ago, I participated in a conference in Wyoming on the topic, Captive Man in a Free Society. One of the other speakers was the late Sidney Girard, a noted humanistic psychologist. In talking of the technologists of control, and some of them were present, he made a comment that remains etched in my mind. The worst thing that can happen is that a person doesn't count. We have always had masters, not only presidents, but tax assessors, school boards, draft boards, zoning commissions, and a hierarchy of on-the-job bosses. Now, in a sense, we are confronted with a new set of masters to add to those we already have. Many are the earnest benefactors out to improve the well-being of man and are achieving commendable results. But the potential is there for influencing our lives, our society, and future generations, sometimes in adverse ways the benefactors have not thought about. We need to get to know these people who possess a new ability to shape our behavior and life development. and often it is not easy to find them. Some flourish behind a scientific verbiage that discourages understanding by anyone outside their particular discipline. They toss around such words and phrases as neuropsychopharmacology, heterozygotes, contingencies of reinforcement, psychoneurobiolochemistry. But the activists have not hedged in talking about what they aim to achieve. I will be using phrases encountered in their own literature when I refer to behavior control, human engineering, genetic tailoring, biomedical engineers, programming people, manipulating human behavior, shaping behavior. In fact, behavioral control was the theme of the Master Lecture Series at the 1976 convention of the American Psychological Association in Washington. The 8 speakers all gave talks with behavior control in this title. The techniques scientists are using or plan to use for reshaping people and their behavior include the following: stimulating and modifying the brain, programming behavior, manipulating genes, controlling people by radio, creating refined techniques for managing large groups of people, marrying man to animal and man to machine, creating new and startling forms of surveillance, manufacturing hearts and other organs, altering dramatically the beginning and ending of life. Such capabilities make it timely that we think anew about a number of fundamental questions. What is man? How should humans be treated by their fellow humans? Is man something special, a being set apart from other creatures or not? Are humans essentially self-directed, or is their behavior determined essentially by other forces? What path should future human development ideally follow? What is a reasonable model of man for tomorrow? The image of man we hold today and the model of man we want to realize in the future are important. They substantially influence how people perceive themselves, and they help determine what goals are desirable. Man's nature has been a source of argument for at least 30 centuries, and there have recently been some significant shifts in emphasis. Judeo-Christian doctrine generated the widespread belief that God created man in his own image. That was comforting, if ambiguous, and implied that unspoiled man had only good qualities. Judeo-Christian theologians also had a great success in promoting the idea that humans, and only humans, had a touch of divinity. The popularity of this image largely explains why the first reports of Darwin's theory that humans evolved from animals created such widespread consternation. In the 17th century, the philosophers Thomas Hobbes and John Locke took up radically different positions on the nature of man. In Hobbes' view, man was an elaborate machine controlled by outside stimuli. Individual humans were so irresponsible, aggressive, and ego-driven that they needed an absolute monarch to control their lives in detail. Locke believes that each individual deserved to be accepted as rational, responsible, tolerant, self-directed being until proved otherwise. An individual grew from experience and awareness rather than being in a grip of instincts, and should concede only limited regulation of his affairs to government. In the 18th century, 2 influential shapers of the new nation in America, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, paired off in much the same way as Hobbes and Locke did, except that Hamilton was not as arrogant or pessimistic as Hobbes. Jefferson's view was that people normally will be sensible and fair in dealing with each other and with any other government, and deserve to be trusted. This view became accepted by most officials and laymen alike during the early decades of the American Republic. The life roles people are expected to play have had their impact on some later day images of man. For example, with industrialization, people often became valued only to the extent that they were efficient units of production. More recently, with the subabundance of goods made possible by mass production in many countries, Families have become esteemed by business and government leaders largely to the extent that they are ardent consumers. In those societies experimenting with Marxism or Maoism, the individual is valued only to the extent that he selflessly contributes to the group effort. In recent decades, scientists have come up with a number of novel images of man. 6 of them are described in highly abbreviated form in the next paragraphs. Most have substantial contemporary support for more extensive analysis of man's nature, arising from psychological and philosophical thought. See the appendix. Man is a bad animal. This image, which got some support from Freudian views about the often ugly, unconscious side of man, was recently revived. Archaeologists claim to have uncovered evidence that very early man began as a meat-eating hunter. From this, it was extrapolated that aggression was part of man's biological nature. Experts in animal behavior, ethologists, pointed out that almost all species except man have a built-in prohibition against killing their own kind if they can possibly help it. In quarrels over mates and territory, they try to keep contention as bloodless as possible. Man stands almost alone as systematic murderer of his own kind. In wars, he often kills wantonly and with seeming enthusiasm. The best-known ethologist, Konrad Lorenz, has argued that this discovery of weapons made it easy for men to kill each other. The adoption of weapons was so rapid that inhibition against their use did not have time to evolve. Lorenz's theory may account for the beginning of man's homicidal habits. But since we have had effective weapons for hundreds of thousands of years now, we have certainly had time to evolve an inhibition if we really wanted to. It is more plausible to suggest that weapons have made people killing more tempting. On the other side of the argument, a number of critics consider the view of man as a bad animal overblown. They have observed, for example, that man has never been just a carnivore. He has eaten everything he could get. Time and time again, men have demonstrated that they can be altruistic and cooperative, that they abhor violence, according to one hypothesis about the manhunter. Altruism and cooperation had survival value. And if man were restricted to killing the hard way by tooth and claw without weapons, as animals must do, we surely would see a spectacular decline in intentional homicide. The important point is that scientists in many fields are coming up with strategies to remove the alleged inborn aggressiveness of man. Man is controlled by his genes. This tendency to physiological predestination has been known to college freshmen for decades. Recent argument has centered around the contention of 2 educational psychologists that scores on intelligence tests are primarily determined by genes. They have asserted further that consistent differences in the scores were related to race or social class. Their conclusions upset those who believe that basically we start off with a fairly clean slate and major differences arise from the way we are reared. As of late 1976, the Genetic Society of America was contending that it had no convincing evidence of any appreciable genetic difference in intelligence among races. One of the educational psychologists cited above, Arthur Jensen, has maintained that 80% of IQ differences are based on genes, not on the effects of environment. His claims have been denounced. Several leading geneticists have advanced rebuttals or strong reservations. One, Theodosis Dobzhansky, pointed out on that you don't find an 80% degree of heritability in far simpler matters, such as chicken egg production. In the late 1976, the genetic dogmatists were subdued by a scientific scandal. It appeared that an early English pioneer in intelligence testing who had tied intelligence to genes quite impressively from his study of twins may have invented some of his data. Whatever the facts, the big new thing is that genes are now considered manipulable, not immutable. The genetic engineers have hosts of plans, some already tested, for modifying man by modifying his genetic patterns. Man is shaped by primal instincts and early childhood experiences. This view, pioneered by Sigmund Freud, remains the cornerstone of one of modern psychology's three major schools of thought about the nature of man, the other two being the humanistic and behaviorist. The instincts that concerned Freud were those of sexuality, aggression, pleasure-seeking, and so on. They may be masked by people, but they remain in force and influence behavior. The challenge is to cope with these debilitating urges so that civilization can stay on the track. Modern neo-Freudians continue to use Freudian's terms and some of these concepts, but most do not see man as a central base. They give credit to the way we live as a shaping influence. Man is captain of his fate. Humanists such as Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and Rollo May have seen man as possessing a considerable amount of free will despite genes, instincts, and the environment. The individual can size up his situation, weigh alternatives, and decide upon course of action. Some humanists from the existential wing, notably Jean-Paul Sartre, have insisted that man can be a totally free agent. Those from the vitalist wing believe there is no physical accounting for the inspired behavior of some people. The historian philosopher Arnold Toynbee, for example, has contended that there is a spark of creative spiritual power in every human being. Humanists in general hold that life provides the greatest satisfactions if people largely manage their own affairs. They work to enhance our capacity for self-fulfillment, creativity, open communication, and psychological growth. Man is a mere reactor to prods from the environment. This proposition is assumed by most, but not all, behavior psychologists. For some years, behaviorism has been in ascendancy. Shortly, we will be looking at the activities of certain behaviorists in detail. Behaviorists tend to see themselves as far more scientific than the humanists or psychoanalysts. They deal only with the observable behavior and are wary of the mind, since what goes on in it is not observable. They measure behavior, sometimes with stopwatches, and design precise testing strategies. Often they aim for and get quick, visible results. The more ardent behaviorists argue that real progress for man can come only if people rid themselves of pre-scientific ideas about freedom, will, consciousness, and dignity. As a general rule, behaviorists are fascinated with techniques of control. Many favor using conditioning techniques. They modify the behavior of humans by shifting factors in the environment and manipulating incentives. Many believe that man can progress fastest by permitting his environment to be systematically managed. In short, they tend strongly to the view that man is highly malleable and needs molding. Man is an adjustable, chemically controlled machine. The most forthright spokesman of this still marginal view is a neo-Hobbesian and a radical behaviorist, H.L. Newbold. He is a New York orthomolecular psychiatrist, and thus is a believer in using chemicals to enhance the success of behavioral therapy. Behaviorists have often been described by critics as being mechanistic. Newbold goes further and calls man a machine. In his book, Psychiatric Programming of People, which is addressed to psychiatrists, psychologists, and those preparing to be psychiatrists, he says of man's nature, man is, for psychological purpose, a computer. This computer can fail to function properly if hardware, central nervous system, is physically or chemically damaged, or if the software, biologically programmed computer or socially programmed computer, is abnormal. It follows then that if damaged or abnormal, the computer must be, insofar as possible, normalized with psychochemicals to get it to function more effectively. Newbold is not alone in his opinions. One of the speakers of Master Lecture Series at the 1976 convention of the American Psychological Association alluded to the man is a machine concept. He said that the flowering of behavior modification has forced people to take the concept seriously. The approach is to modify a man in a desired direction by pressing social and biological levers. So where do we stand? If we ponder the underlying assumptions of most of the scientific images of man cited, a common thread emerges. The same thread appears when we consider assumptions of pioneering activists from such diverse fields as reproductive biology, psychosurgery, and molecular biology. What emerges is a pervading assumption that humans are creatures of almost limitless plasticity. People are raw material that needs perfecting, modifying, or at least improving, either for their own good or to suit the wishes of others. Malleable people are more likely to be controllable people. Whereas the old believers in the perfectibility of people thought primarily in moral terms, the new revolutionists want to change people physically, emotionally, mentally. Often their efforts are underwritten by the government. If their view prevails, people will indeed become different. The revolutionary brain prober, Jose Delgado, suggests that the main question is no longer, what is man, but rather, what kind of man are we going to construct? Under expert management, some scientists feel people will benefit by becoming more efficient and predictable. Quite probably, a side effect, people will also lose some of what we think of as humanness. In each of my books of social comment, I have sought to examine what is happening to the individual in the face of rapid social and technological changes in a specific area of life. This book will seek to bring into convergence developments from several fields of scientific exploration in which investigators are testing the plasticity of man. The investigator's goal in all cases is to modify or control people or shape the way they develop. Implications for both the present and the future will be discussed. The ascent of man, as described by Jacob Bronowski, covers tens of thousands of years. The reshaping of man now underway can occur within a few decades. Part 1, Techniques for Controlling Behavior. Chapter 2, Pioneers in Programming Pigeons and People. The technology of behavior control makes it possible today to exact individual conformity with a greater reliability and less resistance than ever before. Perry London, psychologist. Programming people means getting others to act consistently as you want them to act. Stern parents or employers often are pretty good at this, at least while the subjects are under observation. Hypnotists can obtain excellent results in achieving desired behavior from suggestible subjects for short periods. What interests us here are precise techniques for altering long-term behavior patterns in predictable ways. These new patterns may be desired by the subject or by the programmer or by organization employing him. For achieving certain kinds of long-term program behavior, the programmer need not be a scientifically trained technologist. Consider how the intense and unattractive Charles Manson horrified and fascinated millions of people a few years ago by his control methods. He had an ability to induce sustained zombie-like behavior in his followers, mostly girls. They committed random murders in the Los Angeles area. When a number of his slaves faced trial, they vigorously asserted that the murders were their own idea. They wanted to protect Charlie, who was always somewhere else when the butcheries occurred. In order to prove his theory that Manson had masterminded the killings, that the prosecutor, Vincent Bugalowski, had to spend months uncovering and analyzing the sources of Manson's control over the presumably free and footloose young people. His most important findings were these. Manson was gifted at perceiving the psychological needs of others. He assured runaway girls needing a father that he would be their father. He assured plain-looking girls that they were beautiful. He was careful to destroy pre-existing identities. All the members of his clan had to take on new names. He systematically destroyed inhibitions as part of his obedience training. He supervised naked orgies. When he sensed that a recruit was reluctant to engage in an unsexual act, he ran the recruit through the whole repertoire of homosexuality and others. He offered these insecure youngsters a bizarre religion in which he was an infinite being who would lead them to a world of milk and honey. He was careful to identify and probe what each recruit was most afraid of. Finally, Manson apparently had some hypnotic powers. Bugliosi succeeded in convincing the jury that Manson was indeed responsible for the murders. The 3 Ds of conversion under coercion. It is possible to reprogram people's personalities and beliefs even when they resist if coercion techniques can be employed. A number of studies have been made of the scientific brainwashing techniques used by Asian communists on captured American military personnel. Studies have also been made of techniques used by the Russians in their staged trials during the 1930s and by the Nazis on early political dissidents. Investigators have searched for the common strategies used in shattering and remolding personalities. Brainwashing is not as mysterious as it once seemed. It involves very little reliance on drugs. The so-called truth drugs used for even interrogation have been overrated. They bring out fantasies as well as fact. Drugs have a modest success rate in ferreting out facts the subject does not wish to reveal, especially if he is stable and highly motivated. In true brainwashing, there is also relatively little use of excruciating torture, such as still used in several dozen countries in the routine interrogation of suspects, dissidents, and the like. The brainwashers were less interested in obtaining information than obtaining converts. The latter could be used for propaganda purposes in broadcasting and for writing denunciation of their homeland. For personality transformers, a major early objective is to destroy the prisoner's identity, disorganizing his self-concept. That was also the goal of Charlie Manson. The Nazis, for example, called everyone by number. The use of names was forbidden. 3 states of mind or body, sometimes called the 3 Ds, contribute to the destruction of identity and readiness for conversion. Debilitation. The prisoner is made to stand still for many exhausting hours. He is put in a sweatbox. He is interrogated night and day, with only a few hours for sleep. He is rationed small amounts of water. All this unsettles the normal internal stability of the body and mind. The mind becomes further debilitated as the prisoner is isolated in dark places. Tests at McGill University in Canada have shown that such isolation can dramatically alter mental functioning within a few days. Dread. The prisoner is constantly threatened with torture or death. He is treated roughly, sometimes whipped. He is encouraged to doubt that he will ever see his homeland again or even survive. He comes to dread humiliation or degradation. Agents sometimes tied to prisoners' arms behind their backs and force them to eat like dogs. Dependency. The prisoner is led to realize that his fate is at the whim of his captors. He is helplessly dependent on them for sleep or food. As the prisoner shows sign that his identity is in disarray and may be approaching a crisis point, the captors will suddenly, briefly become kindly. They will become apologetic, offer cigarettes, chat. Then, just as suddenly, they go back to the strategies of dread and debilitation. Prisoner is given a glimpse that his captors can be welcome friends, if only he accepts their viewpoint. When a prisoner's personality starts collapsing, he is welcomed as a convert and is immediately sent to all-day classes on thought reform. Fellow prisoners already transformed joined in pressing the new way of thinking. Some prisoners, it should be added, have been able to resist the full 3D strategy. More recently, brainwashing figured in the trial of Patty Hearst. She had been converted to being an active member of the gang that had kidnapped her. After her arrest, she was charged with participating in a holdup. At the trial, one psychiatrist contended that she had been brainwashed and reprogrammed by the 3D method of debility, dependency, and dread. Another psychiatrist, however, cited evidence that she had been a rebel before the kidnapping and was ripe for the plucking. Approaches of psychologists in changing mental states. Consider the reprogramming of people as practiced by psychoanalytically oriented therapists. The goal usually is to lead to the client to new insights about himself by dredging of formation events in his life. In the process, the therapist moves into a position of ascendancy. Often the client becomes extremely eager for the therapist's approval, and as the therapy continues, may seek to take on the therapist's values or those of society as interpreted to him by the therapist. In the later situation, the therapist can be kind of double agent. Humanistically oriented therapists use many of the traditional insight techniques, but make much more point of leveling with the people they work with. They typically encourage the client to set the goals he wants to work toward, such as great self-reliance. It is the conditioners in the behaviorist school of psychology who have been openly fascinated with the control, manipulation, and programming of people. Some are psychiatrists, some are not. The people to be controlled need not necessarily have severe emotional problems. The pioneering by behaviorists in conditioning humans started in mental hospitals. However, as time went on, the techniques were applied to people of all ages without emotional problems. Now, many of the practitioners want to transform society for the greater happiness of all. Behaviorists tend to reject the Freudian concept that you change a person's behavior by getting inside his mind and helping him gain insight. They feel you don't need to help him understand his levels of consciousness, his ID, his superego, and so on. Most behaviorists want to change observable behavior in the subjects they are working with. Above all, they are pragmatists. Members of a major and fast-growing wing of behavioral psychology seek behavioral change by conditioning or programming subjects. When these conditioners leave the laboratory and move out into society, they call themselves behavior shapers or behavioral engineers. They are confident enough to take on any project for changing people's behavior that challenges them. The origins of scientific conditioning. What the conditioners call the science of behavior control started in a Russian laboratory with Ivan Pavlov, discovery of the conditioned reflex. This was at the beginning of the century. As most readers know, Pavlov rigged up a tubing arrangement to measure how much a dog salivated. He put ground meat on the tongue of a harnessed dog and in the same instant rang a bell. After numerous repetitions and measurement of saliva, He began ringing the bell but omitted the meat. The outpouring of saliva was the same as when the meat was offered. The result has become known as classical conditioning. It is conditioning based on simple reaction to stimuli. At about the same time, the educational psychologist Edward Thorndike in the United States was tempting cats with food at Columbia University. The cats were inside cages. As they thrashed around trying to reach the food in full sight, their claws finally hit a loop of string and opened the cage. The cats didn't mentally make the cage string connection right away, but by trial and error, they did, and subsequent tests claw closer and closer to the string. Soon they learned to go to it directly upon the sight of food. The cats were not just reacting by salivating like Pavlov's dog. They were conditioned by the reward of food to take affirmative action, looking for the string each time they saw the food. Thorndike assumed that human learning might proceed faster if students were rewarded for their correct answers. About 1.5 decades later, an idea-popping psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, John B. Watson, heard of Pavlov's experiments. He let his imagination take flight and mapped out a whole new science, which he called behaviorism. As noted, its central doctrine is that observed behavior offers the only acceptable psychological data. What goes on inside the mind is irrelevant. Watson proposed that you could, by conditioning, program an animal or a person into performing quite complex patterns of behavior. The strategy was to analyze all actions that had to be performed and condition the subject to one step at a time. His extravagant imagination later led him to become a very successful advertising expert. Still, he had announced a formal science, and he had correctly forecast how future behavioral engineers could operate by fragmenting behavior patterns into bits to be mastered one at a time in sequence. The arranged environment was all important in shaping behavior. He even claimed he could select at random a healthy infant and train it to become any kind of specialist you might suggest, whether doctor, lawyer, or safecracker. A couple of decades later, another pioneer in conditioning, the South Africa-born psychiatrist Joseph Wolpe, spelled W-O-L-P-E, emerged and still has a wide influence. He experimented with desensitizing people who were unreasonably scared of something. His best-known study was of people with snake phobias. First, he induced the subjects into deep relaxation. Then he introduced the least threatening stimulus possible, a passing reference to snakes. Step by step, he went from getting the phobic patient to handle toy snakes to watching a small, harmless snake sleeping 30 feet away. In a few weeks, he had the former snake phobic playing with the snakes. Enter Skinner and his disciples. It was a Harvard psychologist named Burrhus Frederick Skinner who is generally recognized as the founder of modern behaviorism, especially as aspect involving what is called operant conditioning. A lean, impatient, cantankerous, often beguiling man, Skinner has become a dominant figure in the world of psychology. Almost all of his early research before 1950 was with pigeons and rats. He has, in the past 2 decades, done some research involving people, especially when he was perfecting his concept of the teaching machine. But many readers of his books find his pronouncements about people exasperatingly short on documentation. At any rate, Skinner has developed a great array of ideas about changing the world of people. Many of his ideas about people are unflattering. He sees broad-scale control of people and the reconditioning of them as our best hope of saving the Western world. Otherwise, he warns, some other group may become more proficient at controlling behavior and directing it into paths we consider undesirable. That group, we are left to assume, might be a communist country or some nasty big brother. When he was asked if a totalitarian regime could use his concepts of behavior modification to set up or maintain a repressive state, he acknowledged that it probably could. Skinner, until recently, has rarely been modest. He states that behaviorism, as he sees it, calls for probably the most drastic change ever proposed in our way of thinking about man. So we had better get to know him and his disciples a little better. Skinner set out in life from Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, to become a writer. He soon decided he had nothing important to say. Because of his boyhood fascination with animal behavior, he turned to psychology. His longtime interest in mechanics may also have influenced the type of research he did, and it may have contributed to his mechanistic view of human behavior. As a boy, he relates, he was always inventing things. He converted a discarded water boiler into a steam cannon. While selling elderberries door to door, he invented a flotation system that separated ripe from green berries. He confesses that he worked for years in vain on designs for a perpetual motion machine. At any rate, he won his first real recognition as a psychologist largely because of his mechanical ingenuity. He developed cages that automatically fed rats on a given schedule if the rats behaved as desired. A machine automatically counted the rat's rate of eating. This evolved into the now widely used Skinner box for conditioning animals. Skinner began conditioning pigeons to perform fairly complex feats by breaking each feat down into component parts, as Watson had proposed. The pigeon was rewarded with a food pellet for each correct move, no matter how slight. This gave the bird an incentive to repeat the move. To get a pigeon to walk in a circle, Skinner rewarded it its first slight clockwise movement. Soon he had pigeons doing figure eights, dancing and playing a kind of table tennis. Later he got animals to perform on cue, even though they had to make a certain number of moves before they got their reward. The precise spacing and timing of reinforcements at each step became an important part of Skinner's contribution to conditioning. Skinner and others also conditioned animals to avoid certain prohibited behavior by setting up automatic punishments such as electric stings. By the 1950s, after visiting his daughter's class in arithmetic, Skinner began to devise teaching machines. He also programmed texts for a variety of school subjects. His concept, again, was the same as teaching a pigeon to walk in circles. Each bit of the whole problem or lesson was learned a step at a time. The reward was a signal that notified the leader that he had been successful and provided him with immediate reinforcement. Readers may wonder what it is so revolutionary about Skinner's feats of conditioning. Most of them had been anticipated by Thorndike or Watson. In fact, a step-at-a-time conditioning of animals to perform impressive feats had been perfected by Russian bear trainers and Australian horse trainers hundreds of years ago. And the phrase, the carrot and the stick, meaning two alternate ways for getting behavioral results, has been in the English language for decades. Nearly 200 years ago, Jeremy Bentham gained wide publicity from his concept that man seeks pleasure, avoids pain. What is brand new about Skinner's achievements is the use of precise scientific conditioning techniques on humans. After Skinner had published one of his articles on what he was doing with his animals, two European psychologists picked an argument with him. They claimed to have earlier published quite similar findings. In order to defend himself, he began trying to think through what kind of conditioning had been going on in his experiments. Clearly, he had gone beyond Pavlov, whose animals had simply reacted. Animals under Skinner acted. They had acted repeatedly in predictable patterns, just as Thorndike's cats had. Why had they acted? They repeated their actions on cue because they remembered the consequences that had occurred in the same situation. They had either been rewarded afterward or they had escaped pain afterward by performing correctly. This memory developed a strong incentive always to perform as Skinner, the controller, desired. That was it. Behavior is controlled by the consequences of previous behavior in the same situation. More recently, Israel Golddiamond, also a specialist in conditioning, put it this way: the consequences are contingent on the behavior and maintain it. Skinner put the formidable label operant conditioning on what happened under his method. He felt that operant was a good word to use because behavior which operates under the environment to produce consequences, operant behavior, can be studied by arranging environments in which specific consequences are contingent upon it. Get it? You put Thorndike's cat in an environment, caged with a string, in which specific consequences, getting the food, are contingent upon hitting the string. Skinner has since acknowledged that he and his followers have simply taken Thorndike's law of effect seriously. Seriously indeed. They have constructed a precise methodology and described it in terms incomprehensible to laymen or to a Russian bear trainer. For example, stimulus response reinforcement paradigm, the technology of contingency management, aversive stimuli, a schedule of intermittent reinforcement. The word environment is central to any operant conditioner's vocabulary. Environment, not heredity or passion or thought, is what makes us behave the way we do. And you control the behavior of animals and people by manipulating their environment to suit your purposes. Trying to grasp the meaning of environment, as conditioners use it, however, can be difficult as trying to grasp a greased pig. Environment can be a physical setup. It can be a prevailing social pattern. It can be a person's life history. I like the word situation better here. A stimulus can be a promise of M&M candy drops that makes you act as desired, and the enjoyment of candy reinforces the probability that you will repeat the performance on cue. You can even be induced to accept a token economy. Another favorite concept. You can be trained to work hard for plastic chips because you know that when you acquire the specified number, you will be given a whole bag of M&Ms. To sum up this technology of operant conditioning that attracts so many practitioners, we fall into patterns of behavior desired by the controller because he gives us incentives, consequences, to repeat the pattern again and again. The incentive can be a positive reinforcer like candy or a negative reinforcer like a whack from a stick. Negative reinforcers are also known as aversive stimuli. And the whole process is often called behavior shaping. What today's behavior shapers have added to what the Russian bear trainers know is this: the conditioning method can be developed into a precise technology that can be applied under the right conditions to pigeons and people and in a variety of situations. This technology of behavior shaping was being worked out by many besides Skinner. Some of these fellow pioneers were flamboyant plungers, some very cautious experimenters. Two of Skinner's disciples, Nathan H. Azrin and Ogden R. Lindsley, moved his concepts from pigeon to people by working with mental patients. Lindsley later reported in an advertising journal on ways to test the effectiveness of TV commercials by utilizing insights gained from operant conditioning. His technique measured how hard a viewer will work to see the commercial clearly. And still later, he set up the behavior research company in Kansas City with a computerized behavior bank containing all kinds of fact and programs for modifying behavior. Charles B. Forster collaborated with Skinner in working out precise schedules for reinforcing behavior. Lloyd E. Halm worked with him in programming teaching machines. Fred S. Keller sought to analyze how humans learn. David Premack, now famous for teaching chimpanzees to communicate with him, hammered out the Premack principle, which brought an understanding of the various kinds of reinforcements that can motivate desired behaviors. Leonard Krasner, who, at a chance encounter, first opened my eyes to the scope of the people-shaping movement, pioneered the use of reinforcement in psychotherapy. In the United States, enthusiasts of behavioral engineers have tended to congregate at Harvard, Southern Illinois University, the University of Kansas, Western Michigan University, the University of Washington, and Arizona State University. At some universities, considerable elbowing has been going on between behaviorists and non-behaviorists. At the University of Washington, for example, the behaviorists lost out in a power play, and many went to the University of Kansas, where behaviorists were more firmly entrenched. On the other hand, two scholars at another Northwestern university reportedly failed to get tenure because behaviorists had the upper hand in the department. While there were many pioneers, B.F. Skinner remains the guru. Partly this is because of the publicity given to his outspoken opinions about the nature of man and how man should be reshaped. Skinner's visions of happy, controlled societies. In 1948, Skinner, the frustrated writer, drew upon his experiments with rats to write a novel, Walden 2, about a human utopia. It was quite a leap. Skinner's Walden 2 is a commune where everything, including work, is shared. Everyone is contented. Everyone is free of jealousy. Everyone's behavior is substantially controlled by sound behavioral engineered principles. The founder of the commune, Fraser, is a man who talks a lot like Skinner. Below Fraser, there are 6 planners. Below them are managers for every aspect of community life. Members are sometimes called controllees. They follow the commune's rather austere code of conduct. Midnight snacks are forbidden. Members are to be quite puritanical about sex. In regard to the outside world, the political manager develops a walled-in ticket for local, state, and federal elections. Everyone votes for it. Founder Fraser explains, and why not? Remember, our interests are all alike, and our political manager is in the best position to tell us what candidates will act in those interests. Why should our members take the time, and it does take time, to inform themselves on so complex a matter? Through positive and negative reinforcement, all significant behavior that the planners want to encourage or discourage is guided. Fraser adds, if it's in our power to create any of the situation which a person likes or to remove any situation he doesn't like, we can control his behavior. People, in short, are seen as high on plasticity. In Walden 2, education is handled as an aspect of human engineering, that is, conditioning. Children are cared for primarily by the group and as little as possible by parents. Fraser, home is no place to raise children. Marriage bonds two are tenuous. Planners hope that with the weakening of family structure, experimental breeding will become feasible. Meanwhile, husband and wife sleep in separate rooms. Even in this Utopia Walden 2 of 1948, Skinner suggests that while everyone was conditioned to feel free, freedom itself is an illusion. His head man, Fraser, states, I deny that freedom exists at all. I must deny it, or my program would be absurd. By 1971, Skinner had pondered human behavior further and had seen and encouraged a broad range of efforts to control it. Also, he had developed further his thinking about freedom and so-called human dignity. His stark tract, the non-fictional Beyond Freedom and Dignity, create quite an uproar. In it, Skinner suggests that human survival depends upon deciding how people must behave, and then using behavioral engineering techniques to see that they do. His basic argument is that behavior is shaped by external influences, not by any conscious decision making inside our heads. He implies that if this affronts our concept of human dignity, so be it. Man's struggle for freedom is not due to any inner will to be free, he argues, but simply to a reaction to adversive stimuli in the environment. He suggests that we are so preoccupied with the illusion of freedom that we are unprepared for the next step, which is not to free people from control, but to analyze and change the kinds of controls to which they are exposed. He writes, perhaps wistfully, of the fact that there is more order in the laboratory than in the confused world outside. But he expresses confidence that the science of behavior will soon be to reduce these differences. And at another point, he says, what is needed is more control, not less. He dismisses the so-called inner man who makes decisions by processes of thought as understandable human conceit. In sum, Skinner views thoughts and emotions mainly as byproducts of human behavior, which is largely shaped by external influences. Thanks more to Skinner than anyone else, the behavioral engineers are on the march, now literally in the thousands. They have perfected techniques, and he has given them ambitious goals to become movers and changers out in the world. What they think can do was perhaps best summed up by James Mcconnell. He is a broad-ranging behaviorist, a friend of Skinner's, but a man who speaks lightly of the limitations of true believers. In addressing a group of lawyers, he tried to shake them out of their frozen view that prisoners can't be changed, so punish them. To make the point that people can indeed be reshaped, he matter-of-factly made this statement. I believe that the day has come when we can combine sensory deprivation with drugs, hypnosis, and astute manipulation of reward and punishment to gain absolute control over an individual's behavior. With that thought in mind, let us proceed to look at some of the current efforts of the psychological behavior shapers. Chapter 3, The Behavior Shapers Take on the Public. Today's band of human behavior controllers can be found in classrooms, kitchens, mental hospitals, rehabilitation, wards, prisons, nursing homes, daycare centers, factories, movie theaters, national parks, community, mental health centers, stores, recreation centers, and right next door. Kenneth Goodall in Psychology Today. The thousands of experts at conditioning are now trying out their behavior-changing technology on tens of thousands of people. The demand is there. Many kinds of institutions are eagerly looking for ways to change the behavior of people they must deal with. Even the federal government has developed an array of programs designed according to Skinnerian principles. This includes programs the Department of Defense has initiated. One psychologist who took part in a defense program recalled, actually the Department of Defense wanted to know how better to control human behavior, not to understand behavior. The federal government has channeled many millions of dollars into behavioral changing programs outside the government. In 1975, the National Institute of Mental Health undertook to make an evaluation of the proliferating behavior modification programs. It came up with a recommendation that more effort be made to try out behavior modification techniques on larger numbers of persons in the general population outside institutions. Some control programs involve elaborate equipment. At Patton State Hospital in California, 21 television cameras were connected to a computer console. A nurse monitoring the cameras pushed buttons to record observations. When she felt that a patient's behavior warranted reward, she pushed a button. The computer thereupon dispensed the reward through a slot in the wall by the patient and recorded voice simultaneously congratulated the patient. Research Media Incorporated of Cambridge, Massachusetts offers institutions a $450 package course complete with cassettes and slides on behavior modification skills. Among those in the target population to be trained in behavior modification techniques are nurses, social workers, teachers, students, managers, and correctional facility personnel. The firm advertises several dozen users. They include the Shelby County Penal Farm, the Container Corporation of America, the Montgomery County Public Schools, and the Department of Army, Fort Bragg. Here are some kinds of situations in which psychological conditioners are attempting to engineer people's behavior. The reprogramming of disapproved behavior. Conditioners have been seeking quick alteration in sexual deviance, whether they are homosexuals or adults attracted to children. One aversive conditioning technique often used with male homosexuals is to show the subject photographs that arouses him sexually. At the same time, an unpleasant electric shock is applied to his genital area. Then he is shown pictures of sensuous-looking women, but without accompanying shock. This technique was used at a state prison in Somers, Connecticut. The subject, all volunteers, were serving sentences for molesting children. According to the program director, before and after psychological tests demonstrated that the desired personality change had occurred, at least temporary, in 2/3 of the subjects. Those who had improved were paroled. Subsequently, 3 prisoners were also serving sentences for molesting children, but who had not volunteered for the treatment, sued the prison. They alleged that prisoners had been denied parole because they had not participated in the program. The American Civil Liberties Union supported their suit. Many civil libertarians are concerned that such programs are a form of governmental thought control. Thus, they could lead to broader applications with political dissidents. Some behavior shapers prefer to use a drug that induces vomiting when the pictures are shown, or an image of vomiting may be present verbally. 3 psychologists in Vermont have experimented with describing to deviants in obnoxious terms a scene ordinarily erotic to them. Subjects were men. Their degree of deviance was first tested by recording the extent of the penile erection occurred when they were shown scenes of sexually attractive males or children. Dispelling adult anxieties and malfunctioning. The desensitization approach that Wolpe used on snake phobics is now being used to attack a wide variety of neurotic anxieties. Compulsive behavior is treated by the blast out method. Implosive therapy. A compulsive hand washer obsessed with dirt is repeatedly thrust into dirt-involved situations. He may, for example, be told to imagine himself strolling knee-deep in a cesspool. After a few such mental strolls, his concern about a few germs on his hands often diminished. Yet another conditioning technique is used on an involuntarily bodily function in order to bring it under environmental control. For instance, a woman complains of chronic constipation. She is persuaded to strap on a belt that presses 2 electrodes to her spine. The electrodes give off a pleasant tingle when activated. She is then trained to press the tingle button just before defecation is about to occur. She's also trained to concentrate on the good consequences that follow the tingle. One investigator reports that laxatives can generally be abandoned after 20 to 30 days of tingling conditioning. conditioning married couples to cope. As ardent people programmer at the Camelot Behavior Systems in Kansas suggests that husbands and wives can reinforce each other. They begin by charting the numbers of times they smile at each other each day for a couple weeks. More ambitious programs aimed at lifting ailing marriages out of doldrums by using operant conditioning techniques have been tried out on couples by investigators in Texas and Michigan. Both involve setting up token economies in which each partner acquired points for behavior desired by the other. Also, in both programs, the partners were required to list 3 or 4 behavior changes they most desired in the spouse. They were to keep careful charts of the occurrence of the changes. The wife might most want to help with her burden of household chores. The husband might most want more explicit affection. The University of Michigan psychologists handling the overhauling of 4 couples believe that a sound marriage boils down to a balancing of reinforcing rewards. He set up a year-long experiment. Each wife was instructed to purchase a kitchen timer and carry it about the house. Whenever her husband came home, she was to start the timer and give him a chip or other token for each hour in which he conversed on what she considered to be satisfactory level. The wife likewise collected tokens for satisfying his 3 main desires. For example, wives won 3 tokens for kisses, 5 tokens for heavy petting, and 15 tokens for intercourse. Tokens could be redeemed from a list of what each partner wanted most. Tokens earned and spent were recorded on the behavioral chart. All 8 charts showed the rise in both conversation and sex during the first month. But from then on, there was considerable seesawing until the experiment ended. On questionnaires they completed, the couples indicated that marital satisfaction had risen in the early months, then leveled off. I know eminently happy partners who would rather quit marriages than spend a year keeping daily records of rewards they give each other. On the other hand, the experiment was clearly of value to the participants in the initial phase, when each was frank about what his or her partner needed to change. But for that, you don't need operant conditioning. Taking on whole communities. While few behavior shapers working out in the real world are yet ready to implement Skinner's dream of reshaping a whole society, starts are being made in taking on whole communities, or as shapers prefer to put it, whole systems. The behaviorist Jack Turner makes no claim of taking on a whole community, but he and his crew of 3 dozen has succeeded in introducing Skinnerian techniques into many corners of Madison County, Alabama. Population 186,000. Madison County consists of mainly Huntsville, the Aerospace Center. Turner has had the modest title of Associate Director of the Huntsville-Madison County Mental Health Center. The center is in touch with many thousands of residents who are mentally ailing or have behavioral problems. But more important in terms of a whole system approach, the center operates a very active and outreaching consultation and education service. It holds classes for the public on behavior management, and it has persuaded the leaders of a host of counties' institutions to adopt conditioning techniques. Classes on operant conditioning for parents are also held. 5 2-hour sessions and classes on positive marriage management. The center has also taken its education skills into many county agencies. Turner explains, a multitude of agencies are potential consumers of mental health consultation services. We have had programs with 26 agencies in the first 3 years of this project, including public schools, retardation programs, adult court, juvenile court, rehabilitation center, welfare department, nursery homes, law enforcement groups, and so on. Behavior modification has been the intervention strategy with most of these agencies. After an agreement is signed, Turner's aides train selected agency officials in behavior modification. One upshot is that a school system there has hired its own behavioral technician. And the juvenile court has begun offering behavior modification classes to parents. Charter's staff claims credit for the fact that the number of mental patients admitted to the state hospital was reduced during the program's first 3 years. Another explanation might be that much of the turmoil and anxiety created by cutting back the aerospace program had eased during that period. A second whole systems approach has been developed in Lawrence, Kansas. Here, the Shapers are moving out from the campus of the University of Kansas, a stronghold of behavioralism, and into the region's schools. In addition, they have set up family-type homes for pre-delinquents run strictly on token economies of rewards and punishments. The results certainly are superior to achieve at large institutions. Also, they oversee a program for many thousands of deprived children in a number of states. This program claims to have raised the reading scores of the children to above the national average for middle-class children. Perhaps the effort to create a community most like Skinner's fictional Walden 2 is a commune cluster of buildings on a 123-acre farm called Twin Oaks near Louisa, Virginia. It was established in the late 1960s. Like Walden 2, Twin Oaks was set up with a board of planners who regulate a corps of managers: labor manager, food manager, and health manager, clothing manager. In the creation of Twin Oaks, the nuclear family was scorned, as in Walden 2. Only rewards would be given. Obnoxious behavior was to be eliminated by refusing to reinforce it. That is, it would be ignored. Appropriate behavior was to be applauded. People who had job assignments they disliked, such as scrubbing floors, got more labor credits than those doing jobs they liked, such as repairing the pump. A dozen or so members I met had unconventional anti-establishment views. They seemed genuinely idealistic and were thoughtful and probing in their questions about the square outside world. Twin Oaks found it had to modify a number of assumptions built into Walden 2. Not only all the members happily performed as they ought to because they wanted to, as Skinner forecasts. There have been explosions of hostility. Skinner's leader, Frazier, couldn't imagine anyone not wanting to work. Twin Oaks has had to tell a number of shirkers to take off. Hardcore of Twin Oaks residents have had many reasons for satisfaction, but placid contentment has not been the prevailing mood as it was at Walden 2. About half the members have left each year since the commune was established. Some have left because, unlike the prosperous Walden 2, Twin Oaks had had a hand-to-mouth existence. It is too poor to use the material reinforcers or rewards that Skinnerians commonly use. Also of interest, Twin Oaks young residents have found that humanistic motivations, such as the simple sense of fulfillment in accomplishing an important task, work as potent motivators. At this writing, the future of Twin Oaks is still clouded for economic reasons, but as communes go, it has lasted an unusually long time. We will be encountering the operant conditioners again, some of them in surprising fields like sports, prisons, and business, but now seems a good time to consider what to make of them and the implications of what they are doing. Here are some questions that seem relevant. Does behavior shaping work? Well, there are hundreds of success stories. As we shall see throughout this book, there is no question that professionally trained people can, under proper conditions, control, mold, and restructure the behavior of other people by a variety of techniques. Operant conditioning is one. When that is said, it should be added that at this stage, Skinnerian conditioning is a technology that works sometimes and sometimes not. Thus, it is hardly a true science. The general proposition that by using conditioning techniques, you can get a whole free society to behave as desired is still pretty much just an ambition. Conditioning works best when the people to be shaped are in controlled environment, such as hospital, prison, or school. It works best when the desired change in behavior is specific. For instance, stay in your seat. And it works best with people who aren't very far advanced in learning. The degree of permanence of behavior changes created by conditioning also varies once the reinforcements are removed. In many of the experiments, subjects have undergone dramatic relapses less than 6 months after leaving the controlled situation. Another quibble is whether the successful treatment may have removed a symptom without significantly affecting the underlying cause. As indicated, the operant conditioners are interested only in what they can see and measure before their eyes, and are inclined to be uninterested in what is going on inside the subject's head. Skinner himself has led the way in this by saying, in Beyond Freedom and Dignity, the dimensions of the world of the mind and the transition from one world to another do raise embarrassing problems, but it is usually possible to ignore them, and this may be good strategy. Carl H. Pribram, who has done much of his major work as a brain physiologist at the Stanford University Medical School, spent a decade working in operant conditioning. He has lost patience with most Skinnerians. He charges them with being anti-mentalist and therefore naive, parochial, and stuck with absolute concepts. Of Skinner, he says, Skinner is against freedom and against dignity and against feelings and against values. He is against anything that smacks of mind, because mind is soft and ghostly and gets in the way of clear thinking about the control of behavior. Pribram's experiments with brain have led him to conclude that the brain is physically modified by experience. Should we want it? Do we want skilled operators playing God and setting our goals, establishing the behavior patterns we are fit into, and molding our social development? Certainly, some of these techniques and their purposes are better than others. For example, behavior shaping that is oriented to serving people is preferable to behavior shaping oriented to giving someone better control over people. Behavior shaping in which the goal or target are chosen by the people who want their behavior modified is preferable to behavior shaping in which the goals are set by the shapers or their employees. At Huntsville, Turner sought to lower public resistance to his team of behavior shapers by announcing that the public would have the final say on any efforts that would be undertaken. He said, "You tell us how you want to change. However, it seems to me that you become a little obscure when you is the head of a large agency eager to change the behavior of employees or persons he is in charge of controlling. Efforts should be made to keep participation voluntary at the individual level. Behavior shaping in which people are simply trained in how to manage their own efforts at behavior modification are preferable to those in which the people remain under the supervision of controllers. Behavior shaping programs that are out in the open are certainly preferable to those in which the controller disguises his own motives. A common experimental strategy. Behavior shaping that involves the use of adversive stimuli is less reprehensible if the person agrees to submit to it, is not within the confines of an institution where voluntarily participation can be manipulated. Behavior shapers themselves argue about the relative effectiveness of punishment versus reward. James Mcconnell offered me an impressive illustration of results that can be expected. If you want to stamp out bad behavior in a prison, punishment will work. But if you want the prisoner to learn complex tasks necessary to succeed in the outside world, then you must have to use the positive reinforcement. So rewards are usually preferable to punishment, but that raises another question. Is life just a bowl of rewards? Behaviorists believe that rewards in whatever form are the prime force in making any society operate. Others now are working what kind of generation will emerge if the hook the young on the expectation of being constantly rewarded for good behavior. Many, if not most, young school children are naturally inquisitive. Would inquisitiveness disappear if school performances is linked continually to rewards? And an expectation of reward for anything that helps others is hardly good training for altruism or community service. Yet another question. Is behavioral conditioning dehumanizing? Well, more or less. It would be unfair to pin a dehumanizing label on all operant conditioning projects. Many behavior shapers are working in humane ways to help people rid themselves of ailments, handicaps, or low self-esteem, and to help pupils learn at their own pace. Still, the fundamental assumption of most conditioners is that you can control all organisms, whether people or animals, by pushing buttons to manipulate reinforcements. There is a reliance on tools such as stopwatches, cameras, shock machines, kitchen timers. Certainly, the generalization can be made that any person who senses that he is being manipulated will also sense that his personal integrity is being undermined. And that, what about the basic philosophic position of Skinner? I think he has done us a service by stressing his startling assumption about the plasticity of man. It is making us think and making us notice that this same assumption of plasticity is emerging in many other areas of scientific innovation. However, the fact that Skinner has forced us to think doesn't mean his own assumptions are right, or even 60% right. For many people today, the assumptions of the Skinnerians are enticing. The Skinnerians assure them that they are not responsible for their own acts, so why worry? Finally, it appears that the conditioners are starting to achieve some quite powerful tools for behavior modification, especially if used with large groups. And historically, they're just getting started. They are still learning. Let us keep an appraising eye on them.